Cardiology basics. I'm just hoping to explain a couple real simple things about the heart that I've noticed some of my classmates have some difficulty with. I don't think really so much anymore, but just in case some people do, this video will be out in the ether so that hopefully it helps some people. All right. So first off, most people know that the heart is a pump. So I don't really think I need to explain that it's a two-sided pump. We have what we call the systemic circuit and the pulmonary circuit. The top parts pull blood in, although they don't physically pull it, but they receive blood. And then the ventricles, or the bottom parts, push blood out. Makes perfect sense so far, I hope. Um, Now, there's two circuits, like I said, the pulmonary and the systemic. The systemic circuit is referring to the blood that goes out to the body, or the blood that is supplied to the body, including the heart itself. And the pulmonary circuit is just the lungs, nothing else, only the lungs. Um, so the left pushes out to the body, but pulls in from the lungs, and the right pushes out to the lungs and pulls blood in from the body. Um, as you can see, I'm not getting too in depth here. So there's two main loads that the heart carries. Think of the term load as a word for work. People seem to get confused by this idea of preload and afterload and what that means. Preload is literally the amount of blood in the ventricles at the end of diastole. In other words, how full the ventricles get, how much fluid the heart has to retrieve and pull in. I mentioned earlier that the heart doesn't physically pull the fluid in, and this is true. Um, but the fluid kind of passively flows into the heart. And just like if you were on an assembly line and you're grabbing a box and handing it off and grabbing a box and handing it off, if this guy behind you who's handing you the boxes starts giving those to you too quickly, faster than you can handle, what do you think is going to happen? We'll come back to that. So the second load that the heart has is afterload. Afterload is how hard the heart has to push in order to overcome your blood pressure and push blood out of the aorta. The systolic blood pressure is the best indicator we have for afterload. Or at least it's a very good one. I don't know if there's a better one that I just don't know about yet, but it's a very good indicator of afterload. Think of afterload like there's this door that you have to push open, and there's a person on the other side leaning against the door. If it's a small person, you might have a relatively easy time pushing that door open. No big deal. But if it's a really, really, really big person, or if it's multiple people, it becomes a lot harder to push the door. And it's no different for your heart. If your blood pressure is a normal level, it's got no problem opening those valves and pushing blood into your aorta. But if your blood pressure is through the roof, your heart um, has to accommodate that by becoming more muscular. Problem is, when your heart becomes more muscular, there's less room inside your heart for blood. And that means that your heart, if it gets too good at the afterload, it's not as good at the preload, right? Because remember that preload was the amount of fluid in the ventricles at the end of diastole. So if there isn't as much room for fluid, it can't handle as much preload. All right, so what happens when the heart fails? So what happens when with that assembly line that I mentioned earlier? If you can't take the packages as fast as they're coming, then they start to back up, and it creates this pile up behind you. It's the same with your heart. If as much fluid as that wants to go in the heart can't go into the heart because the heart isn't pumping it out fast enough, or because their heart just doesn't have enough room to accommodate the increased level of fluid, you start to see what we call heart failure. So there can be left-sided heart failure, right-sided heart failure, or total heart failure, meaning both sides. There's more than just that. It gets complicated, but we're just going to keep it at that level there. Um, to help you remember those, there are some acronyms, or mnemonics, I'm sorry, that you can learn. DO-CHAP and AHEAD. DO-CHAP is for the left side of the heart. When you think of the left, think of lungs. They both start with L, right? So dyspnea, that means that it's hard to breathe. Orthopnea, so that means if they're laying down flat, it's harder to breathe than when they're sitting up. That's because fluid is backing up in the lungs. And so when they're sitting up, it's not good, but it's not as bad because all the fluid sinks down lower into the lower lobes of the lungs, but all these upper lobes are still usable. But when they're laying down flat, it covers a larger surface area of the lungs and fluid, and it's harder for them to breathe. So these people tend to sleep upright or maybe with lots of pillows. They also have a cough for obvious reasons. Hemoptysis, that's when you cough up blood. That can happen just because there's so much blood backing up in the lungs that maybe it's leaking out of the blood vessels into the alveoli, and then they're coughing it up, and it gets in the airways, and so they cough up blood. You might see pink, frothy sputum, pulmonary edema, right? Um, Adventitious lung sounds. You'll hear rails, you'll hear crackles, all kinds of things. It's their lungs won't sound at all like normal lungs. And pulmonary congestion or pulmonary edema, however you want to say it. So the left side, because it gets blood from the lungs and it can't get the fluid out as fast as it's trying to come in, you end up with tons of fluid backing up in the lungs. Makes perfect sense, right? Right-sided heart failure, think awe head. Anorexia and nausea. This is because of the engorgement of the veins, the vena cava and the digestive veins, right? Like the mesenteric veins and all of these. They become engorged because of the amount of fluid in them, and that makes you lose your appetite. You get some weight gain. It mentions edema later in this acronym. The weight gain is really caused by the edema. You start to retain lots of fluid. You get hepatomegaly. This is caused by the same thing causing the anorexia. These veins have such a backup of fluid that the liver starts to have increased pressure, and so the liver cells might not work as well as they normally would. The liver might not function ideally, so you can also end up with some ascites. So the next one after hepatomegaly is edema. Same reason as with left-sided heart failure. It's just the edema isn't in the lungs, the edema is in the body. It'll be dependent edema, so like the feet, the legs, if they sit in a wheelchair, they might have a lot of edema around their hips and even their lower back. And again, with the liver, because fluids leak out around the liver, and the liver isn't functioning at its highest level because of this increased work from this pressure, you'll see ascites, like I said. That's the A in this acronym. The D stands for distended neck veins. So your jugular veins in your neck return blood almost directly to the heart. They go into the superior vena cava and then into the heart. So if the fluid's backing up, all the veins are going to get bigger, and you'll see their neck veins even when normally you wouldn't. So the big thing to remember is the edema, though. With left-sided heart failure, you have edema in the lungs, left for lungs. With right-sided heart failure, you have edema in the body or the systemic circuit. You'll have some liver problems too, which is good to have in the back of your head, and maybe loss of appetite and some nausea. All right. So the heart has its own conduction system. This can confuse some people too, so I thought I'd go over it really quickly. I had a picture here. This picture comes from Elsevier, at the school I go to. Those are the guys who they do Evolve, and a lot of nursing students will be familiar with them. As the SA node is the sinoatrial node. It's at the well, in the picture you can see it's at the top right, I believe, of the heart. It's a backwards picture because you think patient's right, patient's left, right. So from the SA node, it goes through the internodal pathways. The SA node starts the impulse for your heart to beat. The internodal pathways serve to create a sort of delay before it hits the AV node. The AV node continues that impulse through the bundle of His, which is where that area in this picture where it's straight, it hasn't separated yet. And when it does separate, it becomes the left and right bundle branches. These move that impulse down the middle part of the heart, the septum, the interventricular septum. So these bundle branches move down the heart all the way down to the apex, and they curl up around the walls of the ventricles. When they start to curl, they branch out into these really thin fibers. We call them the Purkinje fibers. And this causes the ventricles to contract from bottom up like that, like it's squeezing. You can see at the top of the heart, technically the base of the heart, that's where these great vessels are. So it wouldn't make any sense for us to try to squeeze it like that and squeeze all the blood down the heart. We want the blood squeezing up. That's why the conduction system works that way. When the conduction system is working properly, on an EKG we can see what we call sinus rhythm, which I might go over in another video, but I'm not going to go over right here. We start to see problems with the function of the heart, though, when dysrhythmias occur, or arrhythmias. A dysrhythmia is where the heart's rhythm is not functioning properly. It's not doing what it normally does, and that can cause all kinds of problems. Famous ones are like atrial fibrillation. That's where the top half of the heart is just kind of quivering. It's not really effectively pushing blood into the ventricles, or it's going so ridiculously fast that it's not giving itself enough time to really move any blood. And then there's ventricular fibrillation, which is a lethal dysrhythmia. It's the same thing, but in the ventricles. Naturally, if you can't move any blood out of the ventricles, the body doesn't get blood. If the body doesn't get blood, that means the heart doesn't get blood, the lungs don't get blood, the brain doesn't get blood, and people die. So I'm not going to cover all of the dysrhythmias or anything until I'm a little more educated on it, and so that'll be a little bit. But if I see a lot of requests for that in the comments, I might do that. All right. So I hope that this little video helps. I just wanted to cover the areas that people seem to have the most difficulty from my classmates and stuff. If there's any area that you'd like me to get a little more in depth on, not just with the heart, but with anything, I wouldn't mind doing the research and making a good video explaining that in a way that hopefully makes it a little easier to approach. So thanks for watching. Leave a like and a comment below, and subscribe if you want to see more videos like this.